please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, and thank you to all the folks who have already done that. We have got a truly global audience on this call today. Feel free to introduce yourself by sharing where you're joining from, and if you can include a land acknowledgement, that would be very much appreciated. Also, we will ask you to share your thoughts on where you encounter nature in your life today, briefly in a moment. I want to acknowledge that clearly all of us, certainly in the United States, are in the midst of processing the recent events surrounding the trial of Derek Chauvin and considering what this means for George Floyd's legacy and life, and for Black life more generally. So I expect this will be on our minds and influence our conversation today. Just a few housekeeping items before we continue. I want to point out that there will be live captioning throughout the event. And you can check that out on CC Live transcription. We are recording this program, so please be aware of that. And also, as it says here in the third point, please feel free to use the chat to share your thoughts, questions, and if you need to request technical assistance. And so I want to say thanks to Arlette, who will be giving voice to the chat. And a big thanks to the MoMA Public Programs team, Alethea, Adelia, Sarah, Arlette, Evelyn, Steve, Joseph, and Hannah. And if I forgot somebody, I apologize. Feel free to unmute and give me a shout. One other thing I want to say is that we have principles or community agreements that we want to follow. They're here, right here on the screen. We will join in and use our voice and step back to make space for the voices of others. We acknowledge the courage of each of us to speak. We will speak from our own perspective using I language. We will listen to others with care, compassion, and attention. We will acknowledge harmful or offensive language, whether intentional or unintentional, and use it as a learning opportunity, what people sometimes call calling in rather than calling out. But we will not tolerate any behavior or speech that abuses others, and we will take care of ourselves and acknowledge our boundaries and know when we need to step away. So those are our collective agreements. And I want to start off or continue with a little framing. Today's conversation is part of a larger effort that MoMA is undertaking around this theme of reconstructions and Blackness as an urgent call for community leaders and creative folks to reconceive and reconstruct our built environment rather than continuing to give shape to buildings, infrastructure, planning, design, and other forms that have for generations embodied and sustained anti-Black racism in the US and globally. So the linking of the themes of reconstruction and Blackness to the concept of environmental justice is quite timely on this day, as it is Earth Day. So happy Earth Day, everybody. And this is, of course, a moment when Black folks in the US and around the world continue to fight for justice vis-a-vis the criminal legal system, labor markets, healthcare, education, transportation, and so on. But also, of course, importantly, and to the point, we are fighting for clean air, for drinkable water, and for the right to live and walk on land that is free of industrial toxins and poisons. So the environmental justice and climate justice movements are being led by Black folks, by other people of color, by Indigenous folks in a global struggle that recognizes that there can be no environmental or climate sustainability without racial justice, and rethinking and reworking the built environment, whether it's buildings, homes, workplaces, parks, farms, all of these things, that's key to making this happen. All right, people, we have an extraordinary group of panelists with us today to lead us in this important conversation. These folks are incredible leaders in their fields. They have pushed the boundaries and limits of their craft in generative directions that I am sure you will all find inspiring today. So before you have the schedule for today. We're going to work on some introductions. Then we're going to go into a moderated discussion, bring in the audience with some Q&A, and have some closing questions and remarks. And again, feel free to add questions and comments in the chat throughout. and we will be reading some of those aloud. All right, now I'd like to move to our introductions and ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves through a personal response to the following question. And that is, how is the natural world a part of your life and your work? And I think what I'd like to do is go alphabetically. And so if that's okay, we will start with Emanuel, and then we'll go to Savvy, and then Lake, and then Sara. And for our audience, also feel free to drop in the chat your answer to that same question or a related question. Where did you encounter nature in your life today? So Emanuel, if you'll start us off with, how is the natural world a part of your life and work? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I feel like the alphabetical order works to my advantage sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't. But I'll just say, briefly, my name is Emanuel Admassu. I'm an architect, and I also teach full-time currently at RISD. And I have a practice called Adwo in collaboration with my partner, Jen Wood. So the question is, how is the natural world part of my life and work? I think, for me, most of my engagements, I think with the natural world are shaped by my experiences of growing up in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, which is really a city that has no clear delineation between the natural world and the built environment. And the compound house that I grew up in, like most compound houses in Addis, is a house that's really surrounded by a lush garden, and eucalyptus trees. And there were a series of activities that, just kind of everyday activities that could take place inside the house or outside the house. The coffee ceremony could happen in the dining room, or it could happen under a tree outside. But I also think, some of the more ritualistic activities, like the churches that I went to growing up with my mother, were always kind of churches inside kind of a dense wooded area. So it really allowed for this porous and kind of ambiguous relationship between architecture and nature. And I would say, some of those ideas shifted when I moved to the US as a teenager, and I moved to a suburb in the north of Atlanta called Marietta. And in that context, like a typical suburban environment in the US, things are a lot more manicured and controlled. The lawns are mowed and property lines are strictly, let's say, surveilled. But even in the context of Atlanta, there was always an environment, typically behind the house, where it begins to extend into the woods. Atlanta really kind of reads as a city in the forest. So even the residential conditions were really established almost as clearings within the forest. And I think in the context of Atlanta, the natural environment or the woods became a space for the imagination. And, more recently, as Black people are returning back to the South in a kind of reverse Great Migration, they're moving to the suburbs of Atlanta. And I think the forest, which typically is this mythical environment, has also historically been a space of escape, especially for maroon communities and previously enslaved people. So yeah, I guess all of those things affect the way I think about the natural environment. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. There's so much there, my goodness. And I've lived in Atlanta, I've got family there. And yes, that reverse Great Black Migration is happening for sure. Thank you so much, Emanuel Admassu, for sharing with us. And thank you to our audience members for dropping some really poignant comments in the chat about how you encounter nature in your life every day. Let's go next to Savvy Horne. Savvy, would you like to share with us?
Oh, yes. I just want to just thank MoMA for putting on this really important conversation today, and for all of you that are here in the audience and in the and the panelists. I just really feel very honored to be in this space. And as I listen to Emanuel, it's so much of what he says is also my story, because as immigrant, first generation immigrant, and being transplanted, if you will, to this environment and still carrying the culture where you've been. And I landed in New York City from the Caribbean in Jamaica, New York, from Jamaica, the island. And it was really a very special place for me, a place of gardening, as well as a real super built environment away from the maroonage type town that I grew up at a very young age before getting here in the US. So I like to say that I moved south, and because of the liberatory space of what Black land ownership means to me. I am walking this land with Stanley Hughes. He farms on a century-year-old African-American farm owned in his family. And he's a third generation. And, you know, we take these walks from time to time to catch up on life and the meaning of everything, and walking in the back of the property in the forest, and just to kind of ground myself. And Stanley grows a lot of different products. I think this is his probably early crops of strawberries that you're seeing peeping out of the black plastic. It's a form of agriculture, horticulture that people use to speed along the growth in climate that varies up and down. This morning, it was 35 degrees, and now it's like about close to 60. So just a drop in temperature when you're dealing with certain crops, you have to protect them. And to the right, if you could see all the way, is that farmhouse that was built by his great-grandfather. And that is a hoop house under the white awning, and that's where he would put his transplants, some of them before they're planted in the ground. So Stanley farms organic tobacco, and he grows it for Santa Fe tobacco, and I'm not doing a product endorsement here. And he also grows, he's known for his sweet potatoes, 2 varieties, red Bugard and white O. Henry, and they're planted on that land. And he's very, very proud of it. And he has fed people as far as California and to the West and New York City. And we're always, from time to time, you know, we talk about what the land means to him. And he always would say, it's my ancestors' land. This is where I feel my ancestors. It provides me with a connection to them. It provides me with a sense of security and belonging and knowing, because this is one thing I do know how to do well. And nobody could tell me that I can't be a farmer. And so he's grounded in that, and it helps to ground me, because in my work, providing legal services to limited resource farmers, it helps to sharpen my understanding of their day-to-day. And so his land, this farm, while not within my bloodline, really is a collective ancestral land of the African diaspora. He's traveled to Africa, looking at the various techniques of growing and just discovering how important yams are within African culture. So he's really rooted with his African consciousness, and these walks mean everything to me in the world. It really does. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Savvy Horne. My goodness, so much to say there. I will say you show me some strawberries, some yams, some sweet potatoes, and I'll be ready to throw
Oh
down.
my God,
You're
absolutely.
You're making me hungry right now, sister.
All of y'all, watch out. I'm known as the Express Mail Queen. Packages. You got it.
Hey, let me drop my address in the chat. No, and of course, your comments, of course, remind us that, this conversation today around environmental justice, climate justice on Earth Day, always core and central to that is food justice and food sovereignty.
Absolutely.
You have demonstrated that so clearly in your work and your comments today. Thank you so much. Welcome,
Sure.
Savvy. All right,
Thank you.
next up, we have Olalekan Jeyifous, please. Let's do it.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me.
Great.
So first of all, I want to thank you all for being here. I'm excited to be here as well. And, the way the natural world sort of manifests in my life is a now long-term and long-time resident of Brooklyn, particularly Crown Heights, Brooklyn, which I believe is Canarsie, Muncie, Lenape land. Are the ways the kind of natural environment sort of interweaves with the urban environment, with the urban infrastructure, with urban ephemera. Not so much in the kind of sanctioned and allocated spaces of botanical gardens and parks like Prospect Parks and such, but just on my walks, throughout Crown Heights, Bed-Stuy, Fort Greene, alleyways with kind of overgrown vegetation, empty lots, even the Franklin Avenue shuttle, the kind of wild vegetation that grows along the kind of sloping banks along the tracks, really the way and there are a lot of now, developing community gardens, but I really kind of, I like the ones that end up a little bit untended and unkempt, and so you end up with this really sort of massive, almost rewilding right in the center of, a really urban space, like Crown Heights and Bed-Stuy. And, I'm deeply inspired by being lost in those spaces while knowing that I'm in the center of, a city, a fairly robust urban space. And so, the way I translate that in my work, as you can see in the images here, is that I amplify those moments which are spread out, few and far in between. And in my world, I make them the rule as opposed to the exception, right? Really reimagining, this sort of post-capitalist, post-industrial space where there's a kind of blend of, as I mentioned, a rewilding, a kind of ecological conservation that both occurs as a function of nature taking its course. I really love buildings that fall into disrepair, and the way, the vines and foliage sort of, kind of grow between the cracks and along the surfaces. That has a sort of sometimes negative connotation as ruin porn. However, like for me, again, the idea of kind of this natural ecological conservation, right? A way in which, property in the urban landscape in certain moments sort of return to this kind of natural environment. And so my work is a sort of symphony between where it's sort of wild and abundant, and where it's kind of controlled along the lines of sort of sustainable practices maintained by a lot of marginalized communities, right? As a function of both necessity, but also ingenuity. And those are the things that I really try and show in my work as someone who's interested in putting forth a sci-fi vision that's kind of antithetical to the slick, metal, glass, high tech, or gritty urban, you know what I mean? Sort of Blade Runner way, but a very sort of greening, solar punk aesthetic. But then again, very much interested in the sort of long-standing residents of Crown Heights, Brooklyn, the Black folks, the Caribbean, the West African, the East African, population here, and what this community might look like if, a lot of these sort of practices and long-term residents are able to sort of thrive and create a sustainable, community.
All right, thank you so much, Lake. I must say, every time I see these images you've created, it just brings a smile to my face. I mean, it's infectious. And building on previous comments, we're hearing themes of walking the land, tending to the land. I love this idea of rewilding, and you're getting some love in the chat on that theme. And this reminds me of some of the work that folks in the field of political ecology do, where they remind us that we've created this false dichotomy between sort of cities and nature. And it's like, there's nothing more natural in many ways than a city. You want to find extraordinary diverse environments of flora and fauna, you could find them in cities. I also just really love these imagery because, of course, as peoples of African descent, we see ourselves here. And this is really powerful. Thank you so much, Lake. Okay, moving to our final panelist, we have the amazing Sara Zewde. Please unmute and thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I feel honored to be in dialogue with these fine folks and the 200 of you in the chat as well. I am a landscape architect, and I'll use the qualifying word there as a jump off into my thoughts on this topic. Landscapes are not things. Landscapes aren't real. The earth is real, but the landscape isn't. A landscape is a human frame. It's a cultural frame on the earth. And so, David, you just mentioned political ecology, and a theme that I really try to work through in my work is cultural ecology. The idea that a lot of people in design and architecture talk about space, and philosophy talk about space as being a product of one's identity. And similarly, I would extend that to ecology. That the environment is not a scientific pure dimension. Rather, it is also a function of our identity, the way that we understand ecology. And so a lot of my work as an academic, but also as a practitioner, I have an office, a practice of landscape architecture in Harlem, New York, really uses this idea of cultural ecology as a departure for design. And if we take a look at Black cultural ecologies, there is a similarity. There are across the diaspora in terms of a relationship between ourselves and the earth. And that is exactly to your point, David, that this binary, this distinction is not made apparent, and that's consistent across different Black cultural ecologies. And I think that is a source of innovation. We are what geologists are now calling the age of the Anthropocene, right? So there is no such thing as a wilderness. We live in what Neil Brenner calls like planetary urbanism, like the Earth is one big city. We should stop conceiving of the idea that there is space that isn't, influenced by the human. And so in the age of the Anthropocene, we are confronted with a number of challenges: climate, resources, political, clarified political and social tensions, and all of those things are coming to a head. And I think that looking to concepts of cultural ecologies like those found in Black cultures are a source of innovation for design, for coming up with worlds and ways of living in an environment where we are one with the nature. It's not something that we go to experience. And, I mean, I live in Harlem on Central Park, and people think of Central Park as this rectangle where we like saved what it used to be like. And, that is a completely designed it's an engineering project. And as soon as we start to have that relationship with the earth, that, we live here and so does everyone else, every other species. And our job is to fashion a way to coexist with our environment. I mean, I think that's the big project in my mind in terms of my work. And I have the source of my own cultural upbringing that powers, I think, what's the kind of innovation that we need.
Thank you so much, Sarah. This piece is just mind blowing. Every time I look at it, I see something new that I didn't see before. Thank you so much for your good work. I like to say, as an educator, I like to learn something new every day. And this theme of cultural ecology, I'm gonna work with that and meditate on that. I really appreciate you introducing me to that. Also, thank you so much for bringing up this concept of the Anthropocene. Super important and reminds us, I think, as you were getting at that, we often, certainly in the United States, often think of change, as related to and occurring in 4-year cycles, even 2-year cycles, right, around politics. But if we think about the Anthropocene, as you're saying, we need to be thinking on a geological timescale. We're in this for the long haul. A colleague of mine, Robert Bullard, who's often been described as the founding father of environmental justice, I remember him giving a presentation where he said, we didn't get the first 500 years right, so let's work on the next 500 years. But even that is small by comparison to the scale that you're laying out here. So thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you all for these inspiring introductions. I'd like to now move into our moderated discussion section and ask you the following questions. And we can mix it up, and we can go alphabetical or however you want to do it. The first question is, how, in your view, does climate change and the built environment intersect to create risk and crisis in Black communities? And I guess there's really two questions. And how can we develop and create resources or opportunities for change that address those challenges? So who wants to jump in? Savvy, I could do this like law school and just point to somebody.
Well,
please.
I can try. This past week, actually, I was having a discussion with some students about a project that they were developing, and they were trying to address some issues associated with extractive mining sites throughout the continent of Africa. These are basically actual holes left behind by the colonial project, and really in a way maintained as toxic sites through the logics of neocolonialism. And in that conversation, I mean, the students were designing something that was in New York, and they were engaged in some ways with typical architectural sustainability discourse, which is really about kind of a certain level of techno-determinism, where the building is self-sufficient, it kind of injects energy back into the grid, it has solar panels, it has a green roof. And the whole time I was thinking, but what happens to the people who have to live around those mining sites? And I think for Black and Indigenous communities, both here in the US and really throughout the planet, this environmental harm is very real, and people are forced to either live in these toxic sites, or they're kind of forced to subject themselves to the precarity of forced migration, and there's obviously no real distinction, at least in my mind, between what we would call, let's say, environmental harm and social harm. But when we speak about the climate crisis within architectural discourse, we just want to have these clear solutions at the scale of a building, get a LEED accredited building. And I think, to me, if we're really serious about this issue, we need to engage with those sites of extraction and really begin to grapple with the harm that is continuing to be imposed on the planet, but also on communities that have to live in those sites. So I think this would require a complete reorientation and a relationship not only to the environment, but also to power and to global capital. And I don't think these are issues that can be solved by solar panels and green roofs, I think this requires an extended kind of effort to address how generations of Black and Brown folks have been subjected to these conditions, which means we need to devise direct investments into those communities. And I think that should be an investment into the value of people's lives and not necessarily the extractive potential of those sites.
Amen to that. Thank you so much, Emanuel. Dealing with mining sites on the continent of Africa and the logic and the practice of extractivism, that's certainly a mindset that has done untold violence. I'm reminded of when you talk about there shouldn't be a distinction between social and environmental harm. And I'm reminded of your critical engagement in your work with the idea of measurability and your idea of immeasurability in terms of Black spaces and redefining and rearticulating and re-embodying our relationship to the built environment. And yet, as you said, this is extremely complicated, super complex, because folks in many parts of the world are deeply, deeply precarious. So thank you for sharing. Would anybody else want to share on this question on how climate change and the built environment intersect to create risk? Yes, please.
Yeah, I think Emanuel brought up a very interesting point about sort of the focus on the solar panel and the LEED certified building, right? So, kind of my approach to my work, and again, thinking through, sort of practices of indigenous and marginalized communities, right? Is really sort of operating against the way in which sort of green technology has been financialized, right, by capitalism, and through our prevailing, and in the agreements, he said we should speak for ourselves. So I would say, in my perception, given what I've seen, right, given operating through this particular society, when I think of sustainability, I think of a very sort of middle class, privileged, juice bars, Teslas, electric cars, the carbon footprints of the smart city, right? What we plan to do with the smart city. And absolutely none of that has to do with the communities, most harmed by all of these things, right? So that has always been sort of my concern and interest around that, right? And in just thinking through my own project and really doing, I always say, Black and Brown communities in America receive the diamond package of racism, right? Which is healthcare, housing, education, environmental, and these are all co-constitutive factors, right? And so I feel environmentalism for myself is probably the least known and understood, right? Until there's something that sort of becomes hyper visible, like the Flint water crisis, right? And we see what the sort of response has been to that, right? Which is absolutely nothing, which is Obama gaslighting an entire town and community by drinking from a glass of ostensibly clean water, problem gone. So again, to Emanuel's point, it does require a kind of massive reorienting of looking at this problem, not through this very privileged lens of Elon Musk is going to save us with hyperloops that, you know, have zero carbon emissions or what have you. And you know, again, just reading through this stuff, I'm just deeply fascinated by it. Even I remember reading a article in Places Journal maybe a few years ago on shade, looking at communities in South Los Angeles and how shade is just this massively contested issue, right? That has, you know, huge health impact that I think many of us are really unaware of. And the article really gets into the kind of complicated policies and nuanced ways that local, city, state, federal government keep these communities from having shade, you know what I mean? From making their own structures, their own shade structures, from bus shelters, from you know, fruit stands and umbrellas, and you know what they can do, right? And how, again, the marketing and packaging of environmentalism is a very luxury privileged packaging. Shade is a very shade is a luxury amenity, right? And if you look at aerial views of anywhere in the world where you see an abundance of green, if it is not a natural forest or the like, wherever you see an abundance of green, you know, paired with a community or city, you think of, you know, green lined streets, tree lined streets, you know, and so again, it does require really, you know, thinking through this outside of the kind of hyper capitalist way of, you know, how can we demand that, you know, each developer comes up with X amount of, you know, green, you know, certified in their buildings for this, you know what I mean? It's a much more massive problem that kind of fundamentally needs to be really completely re-examined. So yeah, when Amanda started talking about that, I was like, yeah, that's right. It's just the way I think. Like, I think of green, I think of a Tesla, and I'm like, so I know, and I consider myself radical to extent and progressive, and my mind is even locked in viewing it this way. So yeah, requires an undoing.
Here. So much to unpack there. I really appreciate that. Thanks also to the production team and Adelia in particular for dropping some excellent sources into the chat live while people are just dropping knowledge on the screen. So yeah, I mean, Teslas, I mean, think about these electric vehicles, and we know that these, you know, these ion batteries are sourced in ways that are deeply destructive of our ecosystems. The Altiplano in South America, pretty sure a lot of indigenous folks down there do not appreciate having their lands and waters destroyed so we can drive electric vehicles. I'm not sure if that's
David?
the article. Yes.
I just
Please
want to
jump
chime in
in.
for a minute.
Please do.
And I guess for me, I kind of, yeah, looking at the coastal communities and how climate change is impacting those communities. Of course, growing up in New York and having your first job, and everybody was headed to Fire Island, and then some who had more money or less money, some would be moving to Hilton Head. And you're like, wow, Hilton Head. And you have no idea that this place was Black owned. And today there are like just a few families holding on, and it's encumbered in heirs property, which is a very weak way to own land and that they may lose. So when I look at the climate crisis, the risk and the opportunities, what I see is that as climate change impact these wide, high amenity communities along the coast, say in North Carolina, and the fact that they're shifting westward because insurance is so high, And the fact that unless some miracle occurs, those coastal communities would have disappeared in the next 50 years. So what we're seeing is that as people move westward, they kind of either move towards the mountain or they go further into the Black Belt, which is a traditional area where you find African Americans. And the problem with all of that is that those communities in the Black Belt are already dealing with industries that are polluting the environment, whether it is confinement feedlots or siting of waste treatment, coal ash. I mean, all of this is like creating like a toxic stew. So as people move into those communities and Black folk are moving further and further out into more rural, and you almost feel like Black and Indigenous people here are just being enclosed, right? So we're having an enclosure as they lose the commons within their families. And so for me, the way forward would be, well, how do we transition the type of rural agricultural practices and industries that are situated in rural? How do we transition that into a place where, you know, communities have the right to self-determine what their economies would look like, and how do we provide them with the infrastructural support, the financial support, the social capital support, the patient capital support to help them live in a place that is really sustainable. So that's kind of, you know, I thought about, you know, the wealth that's being displayed when I go to New York, and it's like, yikes, I get it, y'all, when you were talking about the Teslas and everything else. It is like, so after that, what's next? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Savvy. Truly sharing some wisdom there from the coast. And I'm seeing similar things happening on this coast. So truer words were never spoken. Thank you. Sara, would you like to jump in on any aspect of what's been said, or take us in a different direction, whatever you like?
Sure. You know, I grew up in Southeast Louisiana. So, you know, when I reflect on my childhood, there are a lot of memories of running up and down levee banks, not really knowing what they were. To me, they were hills, in effect. And, you know, so some of my fondest memories are on those levee banks and running through canals and all, you know, and in reflection, post Katrina, I've reflected a lot on how much the idea of the big one was so much a part of how we talked about things. And it was always there. It was always, but it didn't feel real, you know. I don't know, people talk about meteors and like, it's very hard to conceptualize these things. And then August 2005 happens. And that, you know, long story short, propelled me towards what I do now and in much part how I think about things. And there's this architectural historian at the University of Texas named Francisco Lara, Fernando Lara, and he kind of talks about the history of the Americas in this way. He says, you know, basically for 10 to 15,000 years, the same people occupied this land. About 500 years ago, a group of Europeans came. Arguably, there were a couple of Europeans and Africans that came before them. But simplifying the story, about 500 years ago, Columbus arrives and you know, genocide and land dispossession occur with the aims essentially of replacing the native people with enslaved and trafficked Africans to reshape the Americas and to extract its resources. So, I mean, you know, climate change and race are not, these instances that we're talking about are not coincidences. the environment that we live in, the climate changes that we are seeing are rooted very much in these systems. They are a function of them. They created them. So, tapping at the symptoms of them, and, everybody's going to the Tesla, really doesn't actually get to the core of the issue. It's the society we live in, the environment we lived in, is a function of essentially what happened 500 years ago, which, in the course of human history of the Americas is a short period of time. So you could say we live in the aftermath of that moment. 500 years ago is like a drop in the bucket of human history in the Americas. And so it's an aftermath. We live in an aftermath, and so our social relations, our racial relations, race itself, and the climate and built environments that we are struggling to fashion for ourselves in any kind of semblance of sustainability or resilience. These challenges are a function of that. And so, it's not, it doesn't help us to just think of it as like, oh, isn't that an interesting pattern? Coincidence. No, this is the way this thing was set up, and so there's some deep work to do. And first, really unraveling that. And then, the project of design comes into play here, because we have to redesign how we live,
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sarah. And that resonates with me also, because I know in your work, you have insisted that public involvement and public participation be an integral part of design. And related to that, I want to go over to the chat and grab a question there and see how y'all want to tackle this. From the audience, one question is, what would reparations through design look like? What would reparations through design look like? All of you are doing some form of design. And the questioner goes on and says, how can we take an approach to address these issues that's rooted in abolitionist politics? So reparation through design, abolitionist politics. Anybody want to jump on that? I'm going to be patient, because I know you all have a lot to say about this.
Well, I'll try. It's for me, I think the answer to this question, to a certain extent, is tied to what Sarah said about what happened 500 years ago. But I also think the question is very much tied to, different forms of collectivity that will help us move beyond the paradigm of individual ownership.
Yes.
And I think if you're willing to really look beyond the limits of property when addressing issues of the environment, or if we're willing to address the history of kind of cyclical dispossession that led us to the present moment, then we can move towards specific ideas of environmental justice. But I think without tackling the ways in which, this regime of property was constructed on this continent, and really kind of in a way superimposed on the rest of the planet, then we can't really begin to engage with these conversations. Basically, I think this work requires radical forms of collective imagination that hopefully would reconfigure our relationship to the planet, but also our relationship to each other, which I think means we have to understand the human as being part of the natural environment, not removed from it, and not needing to be, let's say, quote unquote, protected from it. So I think by embedding the human within our understanding of the natural, we can actually move towards an understanding of the world that is not predicated by modernist ideas of sanitization and domestication. I think this would really move us away from the alienating nature of what some people call the privatized and racialized enclosure. And yeah, I think that would move us closer to ideas of stewardship and care, which I think is really maybe the only option we have.
Here, here. So moving from this regime of property and colonization and commodification to care. I love it. Savia, you're unmuted. Did you, you're an attorney, and I know we just talked about property. Emanuel was talking about property. I don't know if you wanted to weigh in on that.
Yeah. So, so we've been thinking about moving away, seriously, what kind of structures we would need in land rights, land justice movement space. And the result was the formation of, for us, the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, Black Land and Power. And that was done at Penn Center on St. Helena, a historic African-American Gullah Geechee cultural space. And out of that, we came away from that feeling that, well, we had to decolonize the land and that the ownership space had to be more collective. And so for us, we're looking like at community land trusts. We have developed them. You had the new communities coming out of Southwest Georgia that where Black folk had held down 5,000 acres of land and were productive and growing a village. And then just mowed down into trenches as a result of, you know, racist white supremacist attack on this community. And so it has reborn itself. We now have Resora coming out of that as a result of the settlement of the Pigford lawsuit. Black people, particularly the Southwest Georgia Project, which had the new communities, the first African-American land trust in the country, now has a project holding down a 1,600-acre former plantation renamed Resora as a place of resting and creativity, of healing, and of, you know, sustainable agricultural practices, non-extractive processes. And so for me, that place, the healing aspect of that is kind of where we need to kind of move towards in the work that we have to do, because we're here with this planet, and but we have to treat the earth right. And by so doing, you know, we can heal the land, which is especially what we want to do in the process of healing our spirit self.
Here, here. Thank you so much, Savvy. Anyone else want to jump in on this before I move to the next question?
I just wanted to say one thing. I think, and I'll be very brief. I think, you know, I'm looking at the question specifically. It mentions, excuse me, reparations through design. And I was taking that literally, right? But I think this sort of cross section of this type of panel, I think, is something that's incredibly useful. The idea of a much more collective, a much more interdisciplinary way, broadly holistic way of really looking at all of this. Thinking of myself through the lens of design, I often say that design doesn't have in and of itself that much power in this country to resolve a lot of these particular issues, even though the popular perception, particularly around architectural design or landscape design or urban design, is that it does. But it's so mired much more in a kind of very complicated policy and political structure, you know, that requires these sort of conversations between, you know, the five of us up here is kind of a start, right? Of really approaching the answer to that question. And I think that is something that's like incredibly important, right, to recognize.
Thank you, Lake. Amen to that. Oh, Sarah, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add to this that, you know, the kind of thinking about that 500-year context and how that dovetails with this question, you know, architecture arises as a professional discipline along that same 500-year period. And so it was a tool for conducting all of this. That's what the skill set developed to do. Even landscape architecture, which usually is seen as seeing more, is conceived of as being more gentle and favorable than architecture, but landscape architecture is about dominion over the landscape, and that idea is really propelled by the capital generated from the transatlantic slave trade. So the tools that we're talking about repairing with are not actually made for that. And so the exhibit and the work of the 9 or 10 of the collective is you know, an attempt to reinterpret those tools. And so there is a retooling of the tools that's required. And I think, you know, each one of my fellow panelists are speaking to that. And I would just expand on one of the points made, which is, you know, the idea that design is a fee for services industry and that we're in service to a client that needs to be reimagined entirely. And so thinking about the financial mechanisms and sustainability of doing the kind of work that we're talking about doing is a big question, you know, putting designers, and when I say designers, I mean that expansively to Lake's point, reimaginers, you know, to use another word, the ways in which they can, you know, be working in lockstep with activists, with political movements, you know, and advocating, you know, design or imagining is inherently a political act. It's about imagining a thing and therefore advocating for it, projecting it. And so refashioning ourselves as a discipline, as a profession, in light of the history from which we know this, you know, the origin story of these professions is like a huge part of even entertaining the idea that we could have any semblance of a valuable role in repairing.
So true, so true. I appreciate that, Sarah. Thank you. I'm looking at the chat here, and I think we've spoken to this, but I just want to make sure we get a fine point on it. I'm going to combine a couple of folks' questions and really ask this question. You know, you all are an extraordinary group of architects, artists, designers, lawyers, leaders, and I'm wondering if you can speak directly to how the movement for Black Lives has informed your work, or how you are engaging with those themes, and connecting that to questions from Asabi and Anastasia, and I hope I'm pronouncing y'all's names correctly. Healing and regeneration are possible. This planet is not irreparably damaged. So how do we engender healing and regeneration in the context of white supremacy and intergenerational harm, and powerful institutions that really foment and benefit from those problems? So anybody want to jump on that? Small question.
Am I on?
You are.
Okay, well, I mean, just a short statement on that. I feel already that the movement for Black Lives has recognized the centrality of the land ownership, or what we used to call in movement politics of the 60s, the land question, and the need to protect and grow the Black land commons, and really, and some of that could be done through reparations, granted. And I feel that the BLM, by creating a table for land rights and EJ, has taken the movement to the next step for people to really come together and figure it out, and create ways in which we can work together at community level to move various land rights and EJ projects forward. I also feel this is the way, at this intersection with the BLM, with architects, that would be very useful. And in that land and homes and protecting Black folk, BIPOC folk right to age in communities and in place, rather than constantly being gentrified and trying to figure out, well, where do I live now? And so I think there's a role for architect, especially to be more proactive and activist in that spectrum of fighting really alongside us for recognition of our land rights and our right to retain what we have. And in some instances, return land, which is one of the pieces that the federal government is proposing with Senator Cory Booker, Justice for Black Farmers Act, the Emergency Act for BIPOC farmers. All of that, enshrined in that is land rights and the ability to make land available for the next generation of farmers. But in the chat, I noticed there was a question of reparations. No, this is not reparations. What is going on with this is that monies owed to the Department of Agriculture is being retired. It's almost as if they are repaying themselves by retiring the debt of the farmer, but they are also enabling the farmers, if they have lost land or want to continue in agriculture, assisting them in that regard. So that's the benefit, but no, it is not reparations.
Preach. Thank you so much, Savi, for that clarification as well. Would anybody else like to join in on this one? This question about the movement for Black lives, possibly reparations, healing. Y'all are so darn humble. It's ridiculous.
I mean, I really
Emanuel.
appreciate the specificity of Savi's answer just now. I mean, I think, you know, for us as architects, and for me as someone who's immersed in academia, there's a tendency to zoom out and think in relatively abstract terms, but there's just a certain specificity with which Savi is speaking about, you know, land rights. And I think if we're really thinking about an abolitionist practice within the design realm, then we need to go to these sites of harm and really understand how the land was dispossessed, you know, and really understand how the land was transformed into a toxic site that people can't live in. So I just feel like, yeah, hopefully there'll be more conversations between people like us, like Sarah, myself, Lake, with people like Savi, because I think the design discipline in general has been engaged in the realm of critique. And we've been really good at critiquing what is wrong with the environment, you know, but we don't really have a clear plan on how to abolish these systems. And I think the only way we can abolish these systems is by approaching them with a certain level of humility and specificity. And yeah, I mean, I think the legal kind of economic framework of this is super, super important. And hopefully that's the direction we can go in.
Thank you so much, Emanuel. Well, you know, the clock is ticking, and so I'm gonna go ahead and move to our final question, which I'm sure you can anticipate and you've probably given a lot of thought to, and I always like to end on a positive note. And for our panelists, the question is, where do you see hope for the future? And for the audience, we would love for you to participate by dropping your response into the chat to the question, what is one thing that gives you hope for the future of environmental justice? So to our panelists, let's go with Lake. Do you want to start us off?
No, that's a very interesting question. It's simultaneously antithetical to the way that I think, and exactly the way I think, right? And I think it comes, you know, I'm still in the mode of thinking about reconstructions in this show and our sort of collective yet independent approach to the show. And, you know, the fact that we had conversations, right? You know, several meetings, but no one really knew what the others were up to. But we managed to produce projects that were more sort of speculative and investigative and perhaps analytical and speculative, you know, those sort of connections between those terms. And I think for me, my hope is that more of that becomes generative, right? There's a reason why the show, to a certain extent, has been misunderstood by various parties and various individuals, right? And that again comes back to the public perception of what architecture is, what design is, what we do in these fields. It goes back to challenging the idea that Sarah mentioned around this fundamental relationship between practitioners within our field to a client, right? And we understand typically who that client is. The client is the developer, depending on the scale, right? Depending on the variety of scales, you are working for a client that does not have fundamentally any kind of interest in anything outside of maximizing the sort of, you know, floor aspect ratio per dollar, et cetera, right? And for so long, what our job has been is to do that as beautifully, or you know what I mean, or whether we're aggrandizing the client or ourselves, right? Branding ourselves. It has not fundamentally been about the kind of community. And I'm spiraling off into this thing, but again, the idea that we can have these conversations that are generative, that do not look like solutions. I think we need to also begin to challenge the idea of what a solution would be. We tend to, and that comes back to the idea of, you know, quantifying things and qualifying things, which is focusing on what we can see immediately. And what we can see immediately, you know, is a product, and that product therefore has this particular value. You know what I mean? Like, you know, and so much of our society functions around that labor and that product and producing something visible, something that can be directly quantified and qualified as doing something. But I think we need to allow for the speculative, the imaginative, the inventive, however wrong, right, may have you, right? And allow much more of that to inform and engage directly with the kind of practical, highly specific, you know, discourse, language, you know, again, collaborations with the activists, with the policymakers, with the lawyers who are kind of operating within that world. That gives me hope. Panels like this, right? And conversations that come out of, you know, whatever fanciful, you know, but rooted in and grounded in contemporary realities. You know, those things can be seen as having value and informing on a more kind of direct, practical, political, what have you, action.
All right. I feel like you were bursting at the seams to get that out, and you did. My goodness, thank you. My goodness. Yeah. Savvy, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, I'm going to come at it from a different angle, but it's we're still sitting in the same space and the same consciousness on this. And I'd just like to uplift that that throughout our history in this country, you know, Black freedom dreams have been confined, assaulted, and denied, and that the land is the foundation of our freedom dreams. I just want to uplift a speech by Malcolm X, and well, actually his best known speech, Message to the Grassroots, his book. And he noted that all true revolutionary movements is founded on land. And so for us, for me, and the work that we do, with the Black Land and Power Coalition and the Black Food and Justice Alliance. It's about how to create these liberated zones. And for us, it stems from collectively owning land and reimagining what that land could be in community with all the inhabitants, you know, the trees, the forest, the flora and the fauna, if you will, but above all, a respect, a deep respect for the land that grounds us, that feeds us, and gives us that kind of spiritual place to be. And so, you know, a comrade of mine, Ed Whitfield, said that at the end of the day, when we think of freedom, we don't have to think about getting all of everything that we want at once, that we should really seize the moment and build little by little towards that moment when we see the change that we've been dreaming. And so that's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see our movement on land rights continue to grow, continue to deepen its democratization process and collectivism, and preparing places for communities where they can repair, where they can have nutritious food, where we can go back to the places where we live, the simpleness of our little homes that fed us, because we have to reduce our footprint on the planet. Basically, to quote Mother Jones, live simply so we can all simply live. And I think that's where we are. So when I see the built environment, I see it, but now I have the new vision of our panelists. I see the rewilding, the greening. I see the spirits coming out of the places that we love, coming out of Sara's work. I am just awed by being here with all of y'all and what it will mean for my work and the communities moving forward, because now I know that you all are on board, architects. Thank you.
There you go. There you go. Well, what gives me hope is conversations like this and folks like you. Thank you, Savvy. Sara or Emanuel, did you want to share any last brief comments on this question?
Yeah, I should probably not go last because I'm a little bit of a cynic, so I'm probably not the tone you want to end with. Yeah, I'm pretty cynical. I know that there's a lot of hope coming from, the awakening of the last, year or so, but people been knowing, you know what I mean? People, it's like just people been knowing. And so, and even in the awakening, it's like, okay, but then what are you going to do about it? You're not going to change what are you going to give up? What are you willing to give up? So I see my lifetime as being a part of a continuum of a movement. I don't personally don't expect to see so much change in my life in some ways, right? And a lot of the conversations we are having have been had. And, like if you go back to Malcolm's work, as Savi's referenced, he sounds like he's our contemporary, and so, and you can unfold that in history and read the people, our ancestors, and it's we're very much in conversation with them. And so this, I see my work, our work, as I'm going to pass the baton on. I'm going to sprint as far as I can in however much time I have, but it precedes me and it will continue after me. So you do need some hope, I think, to keep going if you have that view on it. And for me, I get that from the small joys of everyday life, the small manifestations of resilience among Black people. Like I said, I'm in Harlem in Central Park, and just, two people sitting on a bench and you know, enjoying the sun, you know. Those moments are my sources of hope. And I think as we're talking about all of the big issues, you know, sometimes we forget why we're doing it. And it is for those moments, right? It is for joy. So just keeping that in mind is perhaps where my hope comes from, in an otherwise cynical view on the whole thing.
Love it. I love it. Like I said in the chat, I'm with you. I'm definitely cynical, but I hear the positive in there, and I hear that you're in it for the long haul. That imagery of people sitting on a bench in a park, I love it. That's powerful and beautiful. Emanuel, have we heard from you on this one? I don't know that we have. And if you're even more cynical, then no need to unmute. I'm just kidding.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, I feel like everything has already been said, and I completely agree. I mean, there's something really profound and beautiful about the Black quotidian, and just kind of meditating on that and what that might mean in the 21st century, I think is really powerful. But for me, I'm also really, again, partially because of my position in academia, I'm always really inspired by people who are out in the field that are actually doing the work, you know? And just like looking at people who are operating in spaces, like I have cousins who are really invested in prison abolition, you know, and they're really kind of doing the work. And it's difficult work, it's incremental work, but it's work. And you know, just thinking through some of the ideas from people in that space, and just how, you know, there's a refusal to kind of provide a clear vision of what prison abolition might actually look like. But instead, people are always saying there needs to be a collective imagination of what that world is. And I think that collective imagination maybe contradicts itself. Sometimes it's fragmented, you know, sometimes it bends back in on itself. But I feel like to a certain extent, the conversation today was that, and we're all trying to somehow imagine, you know, for us in the design field, we're imagining through the images that we're producing, through the drawings that we're producing, and for other folks, they're doing it in their own lane. But yeah, I just stay trying to read up on these folks and trying to, you know, educate myself and hopefully contribute to a slightly better version of the world that we're currently occupying.
Thank you so much, Emanuel. And thanks also to the folks in the audience for dropping some wonderful thoughts in the chat. One person said, hope that they find is in the growing numbers of people who are becoming conscious of what land injustice, environmental injustice is, and that we can push back and work to change that balance of power and work intensively and purposely to change that. Another person says, I find hope from BIPOC feminist land collectives, stewarding right relations on and with the land and all her creatures, folks practicing the art of crafting the communities that they need. That's beautiful. Thank you so much. So I'm going to pass it over to Alethea Rockwell, who's got a few closing comments, and then we'll close out.
Hi, my name is Alethea. I work in MoMA's education department, and I'm just here to say thank you before we close and go back out into the world. So thank you, Emanuel, Savvy, Lake, Sarah, for sharing your amazing work with us. And enormous thank you to David Pellow for so thoughtfully steering and weaving this conversation. Really incredible. I learned so much. And I also want to say thank you to all of you, our audience, for joining, making this program meaningful through your participation. You really make it worthwhile. And with that, just full of gratitude and admiration, I will pass it back to David. Thank you so much.
All right, Alethea. Well, I think you said it all. Our time is coming to a close right now. I want to thank our incredible panelists for sharing their work and insights with us. Everybody in the audience, please continue to follow these amazing folks and engage with their work. I want to thank MoMA for providing us with this space to connect and engage. And thanks to the audience. The struggle for environmental, climate, and racial justice continues. And I look forward to furthering that important work with you all. Many thanks, be well, and good evening.